Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on deploying algorithms in government. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former senior civil servant from the UK, and I'm chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, a publishing house that works with civil servants all around the world. I'd also like to say a really big thank you to our knowledge partner today, T-Impact, for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us and for helping us to make sure that we can reach as many civil servants as possible with this event. So in terms of today's topic, the use of algorithms in government is certainly not a new phenomenon, but their use is becoming more and more widespread and more high profile. And algorithms create the potential for both greater rewards, but also some bigger risks. If used well, they can bring efficiencies, they can improve consistency and accuracy and help to target services to minimize errors and to minimize fraud. But if designed or deployed incorrectly, there are real risks around how they are used, around lack of transparency, and around some unintended consequences that aren't fair or just to certain groups or to individuals. In the UK, for example, we had the big problem with the A-level results. I think that was probably the most high profile use of algorithms here, but they have been used in education for a long time. And today, with the help of our expert panel, we're going to discuss how algorithms are currently used, what the future looks like, and what some of those opportunities and risks and how we mitigate some of those risks might be. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our fantastic panel. We've got some really great experts here with us today. But actually, after we've heard from our experts, there's also an opportunity for you to put your questions to our brilliant panelists. So please do use the Q&A function. You should see that on your screens on the devices that you are used to message in your questions at any point while you're listening to the panel members or after they've spoken. And in the time that we have, we will get through as many of those questions as we possibly can. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our fantastic panel. First, we will hear from Dr. Vic Pant. Vic is Chief Scientist and Chief Science Advisor at Natural Resources in Canada. He's responsible for providing strategic direction within Natural Resources Canada's scientific community, promoting a vision for science and technology and the assessment of future needs. He's responsible for accelerating the creative application of innovative digital technologies, including artificial intelligence, especially in the areas of research and analysis, but also to support evidence-based policy advice. It's great that we can have Vic with us here for his presentation because I know he's got an important meeting to go to afterwards. So unfortunately, he might not be here for the Q&A, but we will get as much from him as we can while he is here with us. Then we will hear from Natalia Domagala, who is Head of Data Ethics at the Central Digital and Data Office in the Cabinet Office here in the UK. Natalia previously advised on open government and open data policies for the Department for DCMS, and she has research experience in anthropology, gender, civic tech, and economic development. And she's co-edited a book, Situating Open Data, Global Trends in Local Context. So a real interesting mix there of experiences and perspectives to bring to this issue. Then we were going to hear from our knowledge partner today. So we have Keith Stagner, who is the CEO of T-Impact Limited. And Keith has more than 35 years of experience delivering innovation and creating value across local government, central government, NHS, and the private sector. He helps organizations with their digital transformation programs, specializing in improving customer journeys, driving out inefficiencies, and automating them using intelligent tools such as chatbots, robotic process automation, artificial intelligence, and workflow. Then we'll hop over to New York, where we'll hear from Stefan Verhulst, who is Chief Research and Development Officer of the Governance Lab at New York University. Stefan's work focuses on improving governance using advances in science and technology, including data and collective intelligence. And he's developed and leads a range of initiatives that contribute to an enhanced understanding and improved practice of using data, science, and technology for decision and policy making. And amongst other things, he's a member of the high-level expert group to the European Commission on business to government data sharing. And last, but absolutely not least, we will hear from Dr. Millie Zimitar, who is Head of Public Policy at the Open Data Institute. Prior to joining the ODI in September 2020, Millie was Senior Policy Advisor at the Royal Society, which is the independent scientific academy of the UK, where she led the Society's policy programme on data and digital disruption, and she was previously Programme Manager at the Alan Turing Institute, which is Britain's National Institute for Data Science and AI. So I'm sure you'll agree we have a real stellar panel with us here today, so please do make the most of them and message in your questions. But without further ado, I'm going to invite Vic to give us his opening presentation. Over to you, Vic.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Siobhan. It's my pleasure to join you and also to have the occasion to meet with so many of my esteemed panelists today. And also really thanks to Kevin and Maria and George and the entire GGF team for putting these events together for knowledge sharing and collaborative learning. So when we talk about deploying artificial intelligence models, algorithms in production and government, it's a very broad topic. And since I only have 5 to 7 minutes for my opening remarks, I wanted to focus in on a very specific part of an important consideration, I should say, that one needs to keep in mind when we're thinking about designing systems, not just at the pilot or the proof of concept or the prototype level, but actually when you're going to have sort of an ML ops pipeline and you're going to have models that need to scale and that need to sustain over time and through time. So I'll be talking a little bit more specifically about explainability and interpretability, also because they have all kinds of other downstream implications that any machine learning leader or policy expert needs to think about when they're putting these systems into production. Next slide, please. So in the Government of Canada, we have a website. Anybody can take a look at this website, and we have a section called responsible use of artificial intelligence. So this is something that our policy leaders, our decision makers have really thought about hard from the very beginning to make this kind of thinking about the guiding principles, the philosophy, the ideals, the morals, the ethics, the values that we want our AI mindset to reflect. Really, it's been codified quite well. So if you go to this website, you'll find sort of our high level statement, which says that, for all the promise of artificial intelligence, we also need to make sure that artificial intelligence is governed by clear values, ethics, and laws. So this is really the framing in which my team and all the other teams in the Government of Canada that work with machine learning, deep learning, reinforcement learning type technologies have to operate within, because this is sort of our high level guidance. Next slide, please. If you zoom in a little bit and you look at our guiding principles, there's 5 of them. And one of the ones that's right in the middle, number 3, is provide meaningful explanations about AI decision-making while also offering opportunities to review results and challenge these decisions. And I know that colleagues in this discussion are from all over the world, and our guests are from all over the world as well. And I'm sure that if you look in your jurisdiction, whether it's at the federal level, at the provincial or state level, or even at municipal level, these are similar values, attitudes, beliefs, and norms that I'm pretty sure you'll find in your nation or subnational jurisdiction as well, as it relates to artificial intelligence. So this notion of fairness, this notion of explainability, notion of privacy, notice of right to be forgotten, these are all important kinds of concepts that we are seeing increasingly on a global basis, not just within Canada. Next slide, please. If we zoom in a bit further and we take a look at the directive on automated decision making, by the way, you will get to all these texts directly from the website that are linked in the slides, and you can use a search engine of your choice to get to these pages. Here also, when you look at this directive on automated decision making and you look at requirement 6.2.3, you see providing explanations after decisions, providing a meaningful explanation, which then that is not just a useless adjective. That adjective takes on a life of its own when you start doing this in the real world. To affected individuals of how and why the decision was made as prescribed in Appendix C. Next slide, please. And I know, as I just mentioned, this is not just the Government of Canada directives. I know if we look at probably one of the most famous places where this kind of reasoning is enshrined and codified is the EU's GDPR. And here, if you look at Section 71, to obtain an explanation of the decision reached after such assessment and to challenge such decisions, and also 58, which talks about the notion not just of being able to access the decision surface or the decision boundary or the parameters of the function or however it is that inputs go to outputs in machine learning models, but really to have them in a human understandable format. So it's not good enough to give somebody a dump of a massive vector or matrix of weights and biases and say, here you go, here's how the model functions. You need to make it so a reasonable person can understand. And that's why I said that when they say meaningful, that really becomes something that becomes quite important in such situations. So all of that to say, that's, if you will, the justification classification. That's the so what to what I really want to talk about here is the fact that it's not good enough to just simply have machine learning models that we're optimizing for some technical metric. If it's some kind of a regression problem, then we're trying to minimize some measure of loss, or if it's some kind of a classification problem, we're trying to maximize for some kind of other metric like precision or recall or F1 score or something. So here we do have to think about explainability and interpretability as first order concerns. This is not something you can do in hindsight. It's something you need to really be thinking about going foresight, full stream ahead when you're actually designing the systems upstream of when the systems will ever be deployed in production or otherwise. So what are some of the things my team is working on in partnership with many other organizations? And by the way, that's really my motivation to present this talk, is to encourage like-minded colleagues from all over the world who want to partner with us to make progress and to make advances in applying some of the things we're going to talk about to contact us. And we're very happy to join forces with you. Next slide, please. So the one option, which is certainly in many cases what one would argue is the preferable option, is to use some kind of a learning technique, or in other words, an algorithm that when you train it on a certain training data set yields a model where that model on a global basis is understandable, right? So whether it's some kind of a model that has a decision boundary or a decision surface for classification, or whether it's some kind of like a curve fitting type of a situation, or whether it's some kind of a dichotomizer of some sort that gives you a branching tree pattern, whatever the approach is, the ideal situation is that when you use a learning technique and you get a model that out of the box gives you its internal representation or exposes its architecture in such a way that a reasonable person can make meaningful inferences about how the predictions are being generated, not specific predictions, but all predictions in general, then that's really a great situation. So there's many examples of these types of modeling families, I guess you can say, or algorithms, regression type models, decision trees, nearest neighbors type algorithms, rule-based learners, generalized additive models, Bayesian models, and certainly they're not all equally explainable or interpretable, I should say, out of the box. But depending on your requirements, depending on the data set you have, depending on the model you're trying to train, they give you kind of, if not full transparency, then a certain degree of translucency into how the model is operating on a global basis. But we know that in many cases, that's not always, you might have a situation where the data set that you're trying to train a model on, these are not ideal learners as measured along some technical metric. It's great that you can understand how these models are functioning, but if you don't really have high performance in terms of low loss and regression or high classification metrics and some type of classification task, then the issue is you have to go somewhere else. You have to go to some other learning techniques like support vector machines or artificial neural networks, which may be a bit more inscrutable. They may be a bit more opaque, but that's something that you need to do. So what do we do in that case? Next slide, please. So here we rely on a lot of post hoc model or prediction explanation techniques. So things like my team works with PDPs, partial dependency plots, ICE, independent conditional, individual conditional explanations, subpopulation analysis, global surrogates, local surrogates, shapely values, etc., and also permuted feature importance. So in this case, even though your model itself may be a opaque box, by using these types of techniques after the fact, we can build some model specific or prediction specific explanations or understandings that help us go from, if you will, the glass box, from the opaque box to a bit more of a translucent box, if not a fully transparent box. So last slide. Next slide, please. So what are some of the lessons learned? I'll go through them very quickly. So this is kind of the so what, this is kind of the what, and then now we're getting to what it is that we're actually doing. What have we learned in trying to apply these techniques? So first is definitely, as I said at the beginning, make sure that you think about interpretability, explainability from the very beginning. Don't let that kind of creep up on you and then you realize you can't put a model in production because you didn't really account for that. Second is, if possible and when possible, account for out of the box interpretable models 2 slides ago, then having to use opaque models, because then you have that extra step of having to have model specific explainability that you need to now bring in as an additional software tool or a additional software step. Also, the good news is that in both cases, whether it's interpretable models or model explanations ex post, you have lots of software packages that automate this. Even 3-4 years ago, when we were using these tools, you had to basically code them up from scratch from the research papers. Now, most of the graphical, what you see is what you get type of data science, auto ML tools have one or more of these techniques baked in. So really, it's not as hard as it seems when you just simply look at a research paper. Another good thing is that just like in the real world, when you deploy a model, it's actually not one model. It's an ensemble of models which are basically then being blended or voting or weighting in some way to come up with a final prediction. The same thing applies to these explanation techniques as well, where if you're going to use PDP, you probably want to also supplement that with an ICE, use Shapley values, Lime, global surrogates, you name it, because that will give you a deeper and a richer understanding of the overall behavior, especially if you're working with an ensemble. You really also want to have an ensemble that you're using to explain how that is going from inputs to outputs. And last but not the least, I think this is the most important lesson we've learned, is that IRL, in real life, make sure that any interpretations or explanations that your technical data scientists are drawing, you're vetting them with domain experts. You're vetting them with the subject matter experts who have a deep knowledge of understanding in the real world about how these models are probably working. And then you can bring it all together to really shine a brighter light to go from a opaque box to a transparent or a translucent box as best as possible. Next slide, please. This is our connection information. Please get in touch with us if any of this is exciting for you or any of this is work that you're doing. We're very happy to partner with you. And with that, Siobhan, thank you very much. I'm going to pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vic. A brilliant way to start. Thank you again for your time, because I know that you can't stay with us for very long. So great to have that. Could have gone on for a lot longer, I know. So I know it's really hard to keep it all to time. But thank you so much for setting out the importance of values, ethics, and laws. I know that's something that Natalia will want to pick up on in a minute. Really liked, for somebody like me, who's more of a generalist, your focus on this has to be meaningful. People have to be able to understand this, and it has to work in the real world as well. So all of those checks. And just your real sense of, you have to build in these factors, interpretability and explainability right from the start. They're not kind of afterthoughts, they're things that you need to do right from the start. Thank you so much. And also to everybody listening, please do heed Vic's call. If you want to get in touch, use his contact details. So these events are all about joining up, networking, and sharing good practice. Thank you so much, Vic. Natalia, I'm going to come to you next.
Great, thank you very much, Yvonne. It's great to be here with all of you, and thank you, Vic, for that really fantastic introduction. So, I'd like to take a slightly broader view and begin by reflecting on why do we need to use algorithms in the public sector in the first place. So there are immense benefits of deploying complex algorithms and artificial intelligence in the public sector. However, that can only happen if these technologies are used while ensuring the highest ethical standards. And those benefits include, for example, providing more accurate information, providing more accurate forecasts and predictions that can then lead to better policy outcomes in practice. Artificial intelligence and complex algorithms can also simulate complex systems to experiment with various policy options and scenarios. They can spot unintended consequences before committing to a policy measure, for example. They can also improve public services by personalizing public services or driving efficiency of public services and public services delivery. And they can automate simple manual administrative tasks to free up the staff to do other work. But, oh, sorry, can we go to the next slide, please? When deploying complex algorithms and AI in the public sector, we need to be really clear and really mindful about their limitations, especially when it comes to machine learning. So AI is not a silver bullet. It's not a general purpose solution which can solve every problem. And we do need to have a very clear understanding of what artificial intelligence or complex algorithms can't do. And in general, AI can't be imaginative. It can't perform well without a large quantity of relevant, high quality data. And this is really, really important. And it also can't infer any additional context if the information is not present in the data. And based on these considerations, it is absolutely key to begin with assessing if artificial intelligence or complex algorithms are actually the right solution to the policy challenge that we are trying to solve. And the second issue that we absolutely need to consider before we do anything else is actually how do we define an algorithm and what counts as an algorithm. And I think that's this is something that we've been discussing as a part of the algorithmic transparency discussion, which is what counts as an algorithm in this particular case. And in the Canadian case, for example, that's very well defined in the directive. Currently in the UK, we have some definitions, but we're still trying to understand what do we mean exactly when we use the word algorithm. In terms of using algorithms in the public sector, we need to consider a number of factors, especially related to AI ethics and safety. And other factors include data quality. So the success of any algorithm or any AI project depends on the quality of the data. And I really can't stress that enough. Also considerations related to fairness, accountability, and privacy. So are the models trained and tested on relevant, accurate data sets? Who is responsible for each element of the model's output, how the designers are implementing the policies that are based on on those systems, and how the systems will be held accountable, what are the wider accountability structures, and of course privacy in terms of appropriate data policies, Data Protection Act, and finally explainability and transparency. So any of the affected stakeholders know how the AI model reached the decision. And another important factor, slightly different to the ones that I've just mentioned, is actually the cost. So we need to consider how much it will cost to build, run, and maintain an AI system, and whether this is a good way of spending taxpayers' money. And can we go to the next slide, please? When deploying algorithms and AI, we need to ensure the highest ethical standards. And currently in the UK, we have tools such as the Data Ethics Framework and the Guide to Using AI in the Public Sector. We also have other guidance that you can see here on the screen. We have a whole list of other AI-related guides available on gov.uk, and this is all to support this ethical and safe use of algorithms in the public sector. And getting the quality of the data is really key for any successful deployment of algorithms. And this is why we are putting so much emphasis on data and data ethics. Next slide, please. And here you can see the Data Ethics Framework, which is a tool that guides appropriate and responsible data use in government and the wider public sector. And we use it to encourage responsible innovation and help public servants understand ethical considerations and give them the tools to address those within their projects. And this framework is aimed at anyone working directly or indirectly with data. And it should be multidisciplinary teams should go through the framework together throughout the entire process of planning, implementing, and evaluating a new data and AI project. And I think the evaluation part is actually really key, and that often gets missed out because once the model is in place, that's where the real work starts. We need to come back and check whether the results of the model are as intended. And next slide, please. So building on this existing work on algorithmic and data ethics, we're currently working on the development of an appropriate and effective mechanism to deliver greater transparency on how algorithms facilitate decision-making within the public sector. And this idea of algorithmic transparency and this idea of openness overall is really nothing new in the UK, because the proactive transparency that we are aiming towards is it's an organic extension of our existing open data and data ethics work. And the benefits of the more transparent use of algorithms in the government go beyond accountability or efficiency. They include encouraging responsible innovation and enabling data scientists to launch ambitious AI and data projects, because they will know that any potential unintended consequences will be mitigated early on, and that the public will have an opportunity to gain an understanding of how the algorithm works, and they would be able to interact with the system. And in order to establish this dialogue, public engagement and raising awareness of the use of algorithms in the public sector is absolutely essential for any algorithmic transparency mechanisms to be successful, but also for the wider AI deployments. And we really want to ensure, in the work that I'm doing at the Central Digital and Data Office, we really want to ensure that the public understand AI, its power and limitations, its role, opportunities, risks. And to achieve that, we've been using various open government methods, various deliberative practices. And we've recently run a project with the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation and Britain Thinks to scope how algorithmic transparency measures should be structured to facilitate public understanding about the use of algorithms in the public sector. And we basically run a set of focus groups and online communities, and we engage a mix of people from all over the UK to really understand what are their fears, what are their hopes, and what is their understanding of algorithmic transparency. And I think I'm running out of time, so I'll stop now, but I'm happy to cover more details on this public engagement work in the Q&A part of this session. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Natalia. Yeah, we can certainly pick up some of those, but really interesting to what you hear, building on what Vic said about the importance of transparency, the importance of making sure that whilst you want to be ambitious on the one hand and don't want to stifle innovation, making sure that those checks and balances are in place so it's done in the most trusted and secure and safe way possible. And then really stressing there at the end the importance of public engagement and how you've been doing that. And we can certainly pick up a lot of those issues in the Q&A, I'm sure. There are already a couple of questions coming in. Just to say to people watching, yes, you will have access to the presentations afterwards, so don't worry about that. You don't need to be taking down loads of notes at the moment. We'll make sure that you get the slides afterwards. Keith, I'm going to come over to you.
Thanks, Siobhan. Vic and Natalie, great presentations. Once again, I'll come at things from a slightly different angle. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit from the practical implementation point of view. But first off, just to introduce us, my company's Impact. We're digital transformation specialists. We've been transforming operations for about 15 years. What we really focus on is improving customer journeys, or if we're working with healthcare, patient pathway, using tools like Lean Six Sigma, and then automating those journeys with chatbots, robots, artificial intelligence, and workflow. We've worked with a slew of central and local government organizations, but our real flagship project is with the NHS, where we built a nationwide solution that for organ donation and transplantation. So every organ donation that happens across the UK, it's our software that decides which donor organ goes to which patient and manages the patient pathway up to the point where the surgery takes place. Needless to say, it was different from projects we did in banking and other private sector, because the measurement of success was the additional number of lives that were saved with some of the new algorithms, some of which the UK are the first in the world to implement. Next slide, please. So when we speak to customers, we hear a lot of confusion about artificial intelligence. What's AI? What's a robot? Is a chatbot the same thing as AI? And the way that these tools are marketed by the vendors can be a little bit confusing, because they're trying to emphasize all the capabilities. But in simple terms, chatbots speak, robots act, and AI decides. Of course, you could use any one of these tools. You could build lots of code around it and have it do any number of things. But sticking to those three key principles will help you to ensure that you're using the right tool for the right job. So when we think about chatbots, we're talking about a tool that can speak in natural language, quite often up to 40 different languages, really good for deflecting calls, dealing with failure demand, frequently asked questions, etc., but also helping to determine what service your resident, your citizen, your patient actually wants to achieve, and doing that in a natural language so they understand spelling mistakes and things said 3 or 4 different ways. Quite often these are AI powered in and of themselves. They generally can speak via voice, as we are now, like on a telephone, also via dedicated chat portals and social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc. And the better tools have seamless handover to human agents, so you don't have to start. You don't interrupt the customer journey when somebody asks for something unusual or asks to speak to a human. Next, Maria, please. In a well-designed system, a chatbot can then trigger a robot to go away and perform activities. So rather than saying, "Oh, I need a change of address," hand it over to some staff member that has to change your address and then has to communicate back with the citizen, sometime later when it's actually done. The robot can go away and do that automatically. And robots perform the processes that are typically done by humans. They retrieve and update data with existing systems. So whether you're using a local government system like a Northgate, a Civica, or Liquid Logic, you don't need to change any of these systems. They just access it the same way that your staff do. And they provide insight. If they're designed well, over time, they provide better insight into your process or your customer journey, enabling you to build continuous improvement. When they've determined whether the service is successful or not, they can tell the chatbot. They can then communicate with the citizen. And then finally, artificial intelligence, the catch-all phrase for everything. We generally view AI in 2 camps. One, the more purist machine learning, where you're designing your own algorithms, as Vic spoke very eloquently about, and then also the prepackaged services. So there are a lot of services you can just link in like a Lincoln set, Lego set, into your existing process. So if you want to interpret what a picture is, so for example, some of the firefighters now are determining types of fire from photographs sent in from people's mobile phone, so they can ensure the safety of their firefighters when they go out. That's a little bit of AI that's built into their normal process. So really good for recognizing images and photos, translating handwriting, interpreting intention of email and documents. All of this stuff is pre-packaged now. So the training models that Vic spoke about, the rules that Natalie was talking about, implementation has already been baked into a lot of these, and you can just bomb off the shelf quite often with the cloud. And if it's and when your digital automation is designed well, you don't have to build interfaces between that decisioning logic that determines what the next best activity is, or is this a chemical fire or what have you. It can simply communicate the result back to a bot. The bot can go enter data into the systems and can therefore notify your end customers or your citizens, and also affect the activities that your staff take. Next slide, please. I just thought it would be useful to touch very quickly on, since we're talking about algorithms, the type of algorithms are typically used by each. Maria, if you could hit the down button for me. So when you think about chatbots, if you've used it for what they're intended, it's primarily around interpretation of the language. You know, what is it that this person is asking for? So most of the AI that is algorithms that are built in are fairly confined, because they're about language, about interpretation of the communication that's going on. Next slide, please. Robots' algorithms are typically predefined. They're not dynamic, so they're baked in. They're usually based on observation of what staff are currently doing today. Quite often it requires definition of business rules that don't exist today. So, you know, you might have 3 different people. You go along and look at what they do it 3 different ways. So you need to standardize on your golden set of rules, if you will. So easier to explain, easier to define, because they're usually well-defined. Next slide, please. When we get to AI, for the prepackaged solutions, the outputs are fairly easy, because it's around a fairly well-established model that's been prepackaged and sold as a commercial asset. But when you get to machine learning, that's where we really get to the risk of algorithmic bias, the risk that it's basing its data on an inappropriate data or historical data that might have baked into it the trends that you don't want to project into the future. So I just thought I'd touch on those 3. None of these are exclusive. These systems are increasingly, these types of technologies are all very integrated now. They come out of the box, they speak to each other. It's very easy to get them to work together. And increasingly more and more intelligence and more machine learning is being built into all of the components. Next slide, please. I just wanted to close off by saying this isn't really new. I think we hear a lot about the algorithms that go wrong. I know that Siobhan has brought up recently the A-levels debacle for the scoring, where the students got 40% lower scores, but across healthcare, across central government, across local government, any number of algorithms already baked in, and they have been for the last 60 years. Some have been baked hard-coded into code and are being replaced with slightly more intelligent systems. I think where the area of biggest interest about the ethical implementation is really around machine learning and learning systems that are applying patterns and making those decisions on the fly, or sorry, being trained based on data to make those decisions. Thank you, Siobhan.
Thank you so much, Keith. I mean, that was really useful to see it set out in that way. So first of all, fascinating just to see a sense of how widespread the use of algorithms is, and even something as kind of, critical as kind of organ donation, to understand how algorithms can be used to improve that process. Really, really fascinating. But also just to see, as you said there, the different tools, the different automation tools and their different applications, and then how algorithms are used differently depending on which tool they're being used with. So really helpful to have it set out in that way. And then, as you say, some of those tools, they're machine learning and AI, for example, are the ones where maybe some of the biggest challenges arrive in terms of you can have some of those biases baked into the algorithms. So brilliant. Another fascinating presentation there. Thank you so much. We're now going right over to New York to hear from Stefan.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. And I couldn't anyway anticipate a better kind of preparation. Thanks, Keith and Natalia and everyone that went before, because a lot of the issues that have already been discussed, of course, are central to the whole issue of using AI within government. And of course, because a lot of has already been discussed, it allows me also to focus on a particular kind of use of AI, which is the use of AI at the city level. Because from our point of view, what we have seen happening is that really AI has a huge potential to improve the way city government and public services, for instance, work. But what we have seen as well is that because of the void that exists quite often at the national level to steer and inform how those technologies should be used responsibly. And we have seen here a few exemptions, such as Canada and of course the UK, that is also moving more and more into providing some kind of guidance at the national level. But in most cases, what we have seen is that there is no such national guidance. And as a result, what we have seen that cities actually are starting to innovate in how they go about governing AI and other associated technologies. And so towards that end, last year I coined this concept of AI localism, which is really where AI is being governed at the city and local level in new ways. And from my point of view, cities actually have become the laboratories of innovation, not just as it relates to the application, but more interesting as it relates to governing AI and how they go about actually both regulating and also implementing and overseeing the use of AI. And from my point of view, there's not enough attention to actually what happens in city. Quite often, the attention is at the national and global level, and there's no shortage of observatories that emerging to monitor what happens nationally and globally, but we have not really seen what's a repository or at least deeper insight what happens at the city level. And that's what we are trying to rectify. And so next slide. So what I hope to do very quickly in this presentation is to give you a flavor of what's happening at the local level. And obviously, Keith and others have already identified a whole range of applications that are emerging at the local level. And this is just a snapshot of what we see happening worldwide on how AI, chatbots, robotics, and of course, for instance, facial recognition also is being used globally. And most of those applications, as I have indicated, actually are being applied and are being experimented with at the local level. Next slide. Now, obviously, we can, anyway, and I have another presentation that goes into what is all the potential, right? But I think it's also important to understand, of course, that there are major concerns in how AI is being used at the local level, including, for instance, concerns with regard to surveillance or concerns with regard to racial discrimination. Next slide. And those concerns are not only related with individual harms, but are also, of course, collective harms, including loss of opportunities, social stigmatization, and so on and so on. Next slide. And so what we have seen is that cities, and as I already mentioned, quite often because there is a void in actually guidance at the national level or across cities, cities have basically stepped up in many cases and come up with a new toolbox, which we call the canvas of AI localism, where they have applied a whole range of policy devices in order to deal with some of the concerns of AI applications, and in order to really move towards more of a responsible AI use at the local level. And so what I quickly will go through is what we see happening and what is an emerging canvas or toolbox at the local level. Next slide. So the first thing that we see happening is that many cities, and that's quite often within city, but also across cities, have stepped up and are really trying to determine the principles that should apply of the use of AI within cities. And so here, just a few, such as Barcelona and of course Montreal, that have been in the forefront in really thinking about what is responsible AI within the context of cities. Next slide. We also see that cities have really stepped up in many places in order to engage their citizens. And that's, by the way, one advantage of AI localism, is that this engagement with citizens and residents is much more direct quite often than at the national level, right? Because citizens and residents have a direct kind of experience on how AI is being used. And it's also more direct in how they actually feel and fear how AI is being used. And so these are just two examples. One is one that we have organized here in New York, which is called the Data Assembly, which is a citizens' assembly around the use of AI and data in New York as it relates to COVID-19 and other applications. Next slide. What we see also happening is that in order to have, by the way, a sophisticated debate about AI and the use of AI, you actually need to establish a certain level of literacy among your residents. And we also have seen a wide variety of cities stepping up, investing in AI literacy programs, quite often, and that's an interesting development from my point of view, quite often with trusted institutions such as libraries. And I think libraries have a really important role to play in actually providing this kind of honest broker around what is happening with AI and data, and what are the concerns that residents and citizens have, and also how do you provide that level of AI literacy that actually allows for this kind of democratic deliberation to happen. Next slide. We also, of course, see that cities have stepped up, especially as it relates to facial recognition. They were the first ones to actually instigate bans. And so now we have a whole range of cities that have stepped up, such as San Francisco, Portland, and others, where they actually have used legislation to stop the use of certain kinds of applications. The judiciary has also stepped up more and more, and we see a lot of actually applications, or a lot of cases that are emerging where the judiciary at the local level is also actually documenting and steering governance as it relates to AI. Next slide. We also see new kinds of accountability and oversight mechanisms, such as, for instance, in New York, we have had the creation of the Automated Decision Systems Task Force. And in Seattle, for instance, you have the Surveillance Advisory Working Group. But you see a lot of those kind of new accountability mechanisms popping up within cities. Some of them are successful, some of them less so. But at least we see new kinds of accountability and oversight mechanisms. By the way, we also see the creation of new positions within cities that are tasked to actually, tasked with oversight of the use of AI within their city. Next slide. We also see new transparency platforms. So this is an example of what's happening in Helsinki, where they actually have a platform where the city documents what algorithms they are using within the city. And so this level of transparency is a great way to actually have an engagement, but also to instigate trust. So it's not only about explainability, which I think is obviously from a technical point of view key, but it's also just, frankly, blunt transparency. What is being used in cities and what is the value proposition that is behind it? And what can citizens do if they feel that there is more need for oversight, for instance. Next slide. We also see actually the use of procurement, and I think quite often that's forgotten as a policy tool, right? Is that procurement can really steer the creation of responsible AI. And this is an example of what's happening in Berkeley, where they have fine-tuned their procurement for instance, surveillance technology, but also artificial intelligence. And we see a lot more of those procurement rules popping up as governance devices for responsible AI. And I think it's very important to take that into account. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned, what we are trying to understand is, are cities the laboratories of AI governance? And so we see a lot of advantages in actually having cities step up. That could, by the way, be translated at the national and global level, because they are really experimenting with ways to go about. And so the pros is that they're filling the void. There is an immediacy, there's a rapid feedback loop, and also, as already mentioned, much more potential for community empowerment. Now, there are obviously concerns. One is that if every city is starting to develop their own AI policy, you will see massive fragmentation of AI policies happening, which, of course, I'm sure Keith would not be pleased with if they're, anyway, every kind of city requires different kinds of design, for instance, as well. There's obviously also, anyway, not that cities are nirvana, right? So there's potential for capture, also potential, by the way, for vendor capture, right? Because a lot of those technologies are being developed by vendors, not just by the city itself. There's lack of capacity quite often, right? We're talking about, anyway, the examples I've given you are quite often the snowflake cities, right? So the New Yorks, the Barcelonas of the world. And in many other cities, you don't have that level of capacity. And then, of course, anyway, as I said, we should not assume that cities are nirvana. There's also quite often a lot of politics that comes into play that might actually undermine accountability as well. But at the same time, as I hope to have made clear, is we need to take stock of what's happening, next slide, in cities. And so today we are launching, on a soft launch, I have to say, the first repository of actually what we see happening at the cities. And that's meant to complement all the other observatories with regard to AI policies and AI strategies, which only focus at the national level, frankly. And so what we hope to do, and again, call upon everyone on this Zoom call, what we hope to do is to actually crowdsource examples, not only just to do an overview, but also to then translate that into guidance to cities, because I think cities really need to have a guidance with regard to how they go about AI. Several have taken the lead to experiment, but I think we actually need to also take stock on what's happening here. Next slide. The repository, but also a lot of our work on AI localism can be found at ailocalism.org, and happy to answer any question in the Q&A as well.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Really, really good to hear about something that, as you say, is not given enough attention, maybe, is the great innovation that's going on at local level, actually, how that's driving some of the progress on this, but also interesting to hear how at local level, maybe people are addressing some of those concerns themselves, bringing in new governance structures, bringing in new legislation even, to make sure that these are deployed in the safest possible way. You mentioned as well, which I think everybody's mentioned, transparency and trust being really, really critical, and something we will definitely come back to. It's come through in the questions, and Natalia wanted to talk about it more, the importance of engaging citizens at that local level and engaging citizens in what's happening. And thank you so much for doing the soft launch of your repository on AI localism. So please, everybody, do go and look at that and give back your thoughts to Stefan. I'm sure he'd like the feedback. And last but not least, Millie, we are going to come to you. Thanks, Stefan. Over to Millie now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Siobhan. And they've been really fascinating presentations. If we go to the next slide, please. So when preparing for my presentation, I had to think, well, what is distinctive about the public sector? So the other speakers, I feel they focus more on the kind of deploying algorithms and the algorithms themselves. But I thought it might be useful to reflect on the nature of the public sector itself and see if that can shed light on the problems that we want to solve. I know that this is an international and multidisciplinary audience, and I don't believe that one size fits all. I think that you can learn from different contexts, but ultimately you've kind of got to kind of make decisions and calculations for your own context, and things change over time. So rather than offer a model, I'm going to offer a series of considerations or questions. And then just to kind of, have something that's a bit practical, I'll also conclude with an example from one of our own ODI projects that was undertaken as part of pandemic response. So next slide, please. So thinking about what's distinctive about the public sector. So at the heart of that is the nature of public interest, right? And I think that, it could be useful to consider the life cycle of the data in question, the data life cycle, because that might help us think about what it would be involved in deploying algorithms in the public sector. So we know that sometimes there is data that is generated by citizens, and also there is data where the collection and curation of it is paid for by citizens. And sometimes it's both. The data is generated by citizens, and then the collection and curation of it is paid for by citizens through taxes. And so the question I want to invite you to reflect on is, well, could there be an obligation for the public sector to ensure that data is used for the public interest? So if we have a tool that we think is really powerful and it's derived from this data that's collected and curated and generated by the citizens and collected and curated through their taxes, could there be an obligation of the public sector around that? So that's the first question. Next slide, please. So thinking about another aspect of the public interest, I think it could be helpful to reflect on the nature of the social contract, which is the relationship between the state and its citizens. So some outcomes in the public interest, or for citizens, can be optimized through speed and operational efficiency. And some outcomes can be optimized through analytic decision-making of complex variables. And I think these are the kinds of examples that we've seen in the presentation so far, right, when algorithms can be most effective or powerful. But I think it might also be worth considering or reflecting on outcomes for citizens that depend on other factors, such as relationships or engagement over time. So I find these an interesting use case or thought experiment, because superficially, it can seem slower, not very efficient, not very kind of optimal. And in the short term, it can also seem expensive, inefficient, and so on, right? But then if you kind of broaden your perspective and think either long term or in terms of the relative vulnerability of maybe some of these people, the intractability of these challenges, maybe the kind of slower, more initially expensive approach gets you the more sustainable and robust outcome, even though that might not be obvious in the short term. So that's worth thinking about too, I think. Okay, so next slide, please. So another area that I think it's worth thinking about in relation to, thinking what's unique about or distinctive about the public sector, what's the nature of public interest. So we know that there's high public acceptance of the use of algorithms by the private sector. There's generally most people have accepted big tech, but there's also increasing societal pressure on policymakers to regulate the private sector in this aspect, to regulate the use of algorithms, by the private sector and in big tech. So there's an interesting contradiction there, in that there's public acceptance of industry using this technology, and then public leaning on government to try to lean on industry. So then the thought experiment I want to put back to you is, well, what are the opportunities for the public sector to show leadership in its use of algorithms, and use that as a tool to influence or set public expectations for the private sector and civil society. So rather than the policy or legislative tools of taxation or legislation, regulation, how about demonstrating leadership, letting that set public expectations, and that raises the bar for what the public expect from industry and from civil society in their use of algorithms. So that's something I think is also worth us reflecting on. And then my final slide, thank you. So again, an aspect of, I think, public interest is the ethical dimension. That's something that's really come through in the presentation so far, and I can see it coming through in the questions. So I think that we're quite familiar with thinking about the consequences of attempting a use case and it going badly. And I think that's the kind of, the underlying fear or anxiety that a lot of people have about deploying algorithms in the public sector, where there's so much emphasis on getting an ethically good outcome. But equally, we have kind of models and methodologies for trying to assess or evaluate the consequences of attempting a use case and it going well. So we have a lot of experience in doing different kinds of cost-benefit analysis, and these are becoming increasingly quite sophisticated, or thinking about different ways of, I guess, trying to measure or assess risk and benefits and so on. But the question I want to put to you is, what are the consequences of not attempting a use case and not securing potential benefits for part of our community? And so I'm going to talk a bit about a project that we did at the ODI that I think could be relevant to this. So in the winter, we undertook a rapid research project in collaboration with social media company Mumsnet, which is a kind of a web forum for parents, to talk about parenthood, and Bernardo's, which is a large civil society charity organisation in the UK that provides support to children. So we wanted to look at the impact of emergency homeschooling as part of the government's pandemic response, and look at the impact of that on children, but also to think more broadly, not just the impact on children, but the impact on their families, the impact on teachers and so on, and looking beyond the kind of educational impacts on them to their well-being and so on. So to answer those questions, we needed to combine or work with different data sets from different sources, from industry, from government, from civil society and so on. And it was a really successful project, but we were aware that there were limitations in the data that we were working with. There were implicit biases. So Mumsnet, as you can imagine, is full of mothers, and fathers heavily underrepresented on Mumsnet. So we knew that the data was biased, right? We could also suspect, but not prove, the kind of the population or the community on Mumsnet would be people who were quite confident using English, maybe had sufficient broadband access that they could spend time online, all sorts of kind of variables like that. So we knew it wasn't representative of parenthood or of the UK population. So we had to think, well, we know the data's biased, we know the data's limited. So do we not do the research? What do we do? And the question we then asked ourselves is, well, what are the consequences of not attempting this? So yeah, we might not get it entirely right, but if we do nothing, then we know that's definitely going to allow certain harms to continue. So that was quite challenging for us, and it made us think differently about, or think what other questions should we be asking beyond the kind of success or failure. So I hope that can be helpful for thinking about, ways of navigating this, and yeah, open to discussion now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Millie. What a great place to end our presentations, posing all of those questions, which I think build on what other panel members have said, but also give lots of food for thought for the Q&A section. So is there an obligation on the public sector to use data for the public good when it's public data, it's been paid for by the public? And also, I really like what you were saying there about the public sector as a leader. So what are the expectations that they should set for other sectors to follow? And then also, I think, which other people have touched as well, which I think Natalia mentioned as well, thinking about when should you not deploy an algorithm? When is it not the best solution? And what might the consequences of that be for not deploying an algorithm as well? And really good to have that case study at the end. Thank you so much, everybody, for your presentations. We've got lots of questions coming in. So I'm going to dive straight in with a couple of the questions that have come in. One is from Michael. I think it's from Michael around, it was aimed at Natalia, but I'm going to ask other panel members as well about, could you give any examples of the specific issues discussed at the various focus groups? And I want to combine that question as well with Kirsty has asked, is there a single place where we can see all of the AI and algorithms that are currently in use in the UK government? So I want to pose this question to all the panel members, but in a slightly different way. One is, Natalia, you can answer about the specific questions that were used in the focus group, but for other panel members, Stefan in particular, you mentioned the Citizens' Assembly. So where have you seen good examples of engaging the public? What kind of questions should we be asking the public? And then secondly, obviously, Stefan, you put your repository there. So that's another place where people can go and see how these are being used. But could other panel members give examples as well of maybe where people can find some examples of where kind of algorithms are being used? Is there places that people can go? Natalia, I'm going to come to you first on these.
Great, thank you very much. Excellent questions. I'll start with the one where there is a place with all the algorithms used in the UK government. My answer is I wish there was, because that would most certainly make my job much easier, but unfortunately there isn't. But that's hopefully something that we can establish in the future. In terms of the specific issues that we tested in the focus groups, so we had 3 fictional scenarios that we were working from. All of them were about the various use of algorithms. So we had the recruitment scenario, which was about the public sector organization using algorithmic tools to identify the most promising candidates to interview. We had a policing scenario. So the local police service is using an algorithmic decision-making system to help decide when and where to allocate police officers. And we also had a parking scenario, which was the local car park is using an algorithm decision-making system to notify the traffic warden to check your vehicle if you don't have a valid local parking permit. So as you can see, we had very different scenarios with different levels of emotive responses that they generated. And in the period of 3 weeks, we actually tested those scenarios in various ways. So we asked the participants about the potential risks that they can think of. We've also asked them about their previous experience with any computer-assisted decision-making in their lives. We've also asked them about their wider expectations on how any computer-assisted and algorithmic-assisted decisions might have in their lives. And then in the second phase of the project, we had more specific questions around this scenario. So what are the problems that you anticipate? Would you be comfortable with algorithms being used in this particular case? And then in the final stage of the research, we discussed what kind of transparency expectations they would like to see based on all these scenarios. And there is a very detailed report coming out in the next couple of weeks, so it will be available on gov.uk, and so then you'll be able to read all about it. But basically, the goal was to test responses across various scenarios that evoked different emotions based on the perception of risks and benefits.
Fantastic, thanks, Natalia. Stefan, I'm going to come over to you. Is that a similar thing? Is that how it's done at local level from your experience? And do you know of any other kind of repositories where people can go to see examples?
Yeah, well, I've put a link in the answer to the question that documents a little bit about the work that we've done in the context of the data assemblies, but also is part of a OECD blog and an initiative that really focuses on new participatory ways to engage with citizens. And so you might find some other examples there as well that might have been applied to other topic areas, but equally can be applied to AI and data. And our approach was somewhat similar to what Natalia mentioned, because I do believe that we need to go beyond the binary discussion. Are you for or against, right? Right. Well, it depends, right? And it's similar to what Millie was referring to with regard to the use case. It depends on the use case and how it is structured and what is the purpose and intent that one seeks to establish. And I think we need to have those kinds of scenario discussions where you really can understand that there are X amount of variables that determine an outcome, and that you can actually have a sophisticated debate with the public about what are the variables that you're most worried about and what do you believe should be the conditions under which actually those kinds of scenarios can happen. Because it's not anyway, the assumption is quite often that the public is violently against. Well, again, it depends, right? Right? It depends on how it is structured. And I think having a discussion about that, that also means, by the way, Siobhan, that you do need to use those assemblies or those deliberations for public education as well. Because what we have done is to each time before we even went into the scenarios, we tried to test what is actually the level of understanding, right? So if we quite often talk about, well, don't worry, this is going to be aggregated and anonymized data, right? Well, does anyone know what it means, right? Yeah. And so just having a discussion about this is what we mean, right, opens up then a more sophisticated discussion because there's a better understanding. And I think that's what needs to happen, both education and deliberation at the same time. And I think it also needs to happen, by the way, in a systematic way, not just the one-offs that we see all the time. It has to be part of how you go about actually implementing not only AI, but technology in general.
Now, Millie, I can see you shaking your head there to what Stefan's saying. Did you want to come in there?
Yeah, well, maybe nodding. So just, I completely agree on the kind of
nodding. Yes, nodding, not shaking.
Maybe, you know, I really agree on the importance of public education. I think, you know, transparency alone isn't sufficient, right? And we know that from open data. Like, transparency alone doesn't get you everything that you want. There's got to be accountability, you know, and in this particular case, the accountability comes from, you know, being able to be challenged, being held to account on the kind of effectiveness of the decision making. And that means that those doing the kind of holding you to account need to understand and so on. So I'd like to see not just investment in that kind of, you know, listing and aggregating, you know, the kinds of algorithms that are in use and the context in which they're in use, but equal investment in ensuring public understanding of this so that it can be challenged when necessary.
Fantastic, thank you. Keith, I am going to come to you, but we've got lots of questions coming in. So unless you wanted to add anything, I'm going to come to you first for the next 2 questions, if that's okay. And if you did want to add anything, then feel free. But I also want to say to people listening, thank you so much for sending in your questions. And if we're not able to get through all of them, don't worry, we will try and answer them for you afterwards. We'll make sure that is done. And also a feedback survey has just been sent round. So please take a couple of minutes after this event to fill in that survey for us. It's really helpful for us at Global Government Forum to make sure we keep producing the kind of events that are the most useful for you. So Keith, I'm going to come to you first. I'm going to combine 2 questions because we've got so many coming in. But you did mention, Keith, in your presentation about the challenge around making sure that kind of human biases and human prejudices are not baked in some of the algorithm. There's a question here from Andrew about AI algorithms have been found to racially discriminate. Given the need to front-load ethical questions into the programming AI, can such discrimination actually be stripped out of algorithms? And also, I want to ask the question from Oliver, so you can ask them both about good AI. All of you mentioned this, I think, needs good and reliable data. And is government getting better, essentially, he's asking, at kind of gathering, storing, and sharing data? So those two questions first to you, Keith.
Well, I think some of the racial prejudice that, the industry that's probably most famous for some of this racial prejudice has been banking, where credit decisions were made based on historical data, and people that were refused credit in the past, there was more there was a propensity for this social segment versus that social segment that tended to align to race. So what the mistakes that were being made at the time was they were just taking historical data, pumping it through the training module, and not really evaluating the results and looking for the patterns and understanding the implications. So you need to understand how the algorithms that you define is interpreting the data sets that you're feeding in, and determine if you need to change the weighting for some of the parameters that are actually used. And I think I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, but in any of these solutions, like any technology, it's very important to compare the results to what you actually expect, and to put yourself in the customer's perspective and understand how that's going to be interpreted. To Millie's point and Stephen's point about the communication and the accountability is very important. But before you even get to that, evaluate it internally and understand what the training has resulted in, and look at it with that view. In almost all training programs, there's an initial data cleansing where you're looking at closing the gaps in the data that you have, pulling data from multiple sources, but also looking at eliminating data that could bias the algorithm that you set up for your machine learning.
Thanks, Keith. Natalia, this must be something that you are very conscious of in terms of the ethical issues. Do you think it's possible to kind of mitigate those risks around discrimination in the algorithms?
I think it's not only possible but also necessary, and this is what we're saying in all the guidance that we have on data ethics, and we've provided a set of actions that people can take to check their data for any potential bias and also to mitigate it. And our colleagues from the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation as well have been working on that. They published a review on algorithmic bias that has a set of practical recommendations to policymakers on how to prevent and mitigate bias. So absolutely, that's something that we have been thinking about, something that we have been working on. And hopefully with time we will get better and better in terms of mitigating bias.
Thanks. Millie, your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one because it's there's now plenty of evidence about bias in data sets and the kind of repercussions of that. And some people have talked about synthetic data as an alternative to that, so kind of creating new data sets to train the algorithm on and so on. But the danger here is that there are other kinds of biases, such as biases in the questions that we choose to ask, or biases in the kind of areas of that we might choose to deploy an algorithm, biases in the assumptions that we make about the data and so on. So it's the kind of addressing bias in data isn't going to get you bias-free algorithms. So again, we're going to need to think kind of more holistically, more long-term and more broadly about the nature of structural inequalities in our society. The technology itself is neither the problem nor the solution.
Yeah, interesting way of looking at it. Stefan, your thoughts both on the discrimination, but also I know you do a lot of work on data as well, and kind of so that issue of kind of our governments getting better at gathering the data that we need to be able to maximize the benefits of algorithms as well.
Well, just to answer your last question, I think one of the ethical elements that quite often is not addressed in those discussions is actually the ethics of data asymmetries. By which I mean is that quite often, as already was mentioned, there is problems with data, but quite often the problem is also not having data or not having enough data. And it turns out that the data is widely distributed and quite often not available, right, in order to actually improve the algorithms or improve decision-making in general, from my point of view. And I think data asymmetries, i.e. the divide that exists between those that need data to improve people's lives and those that have data that actually, if made available, could improve the way they go about decisions, that divide is equally ethical from my point of view, because it actually, anyway, instigates certain kinds of power asymmetries and keep those power asymmetries alive, and actually creates new ones, right? And so from my point of view, it's very important to focus on the bias, but it's also very important to actually focus on access to data and ensure that anyway, there is some kind of a responsibility, which is why we typically call, when we talk about data responsibility, it's not just about protecting, it's also a responsibility to provide access to data when there is a clear public interest as well. And that seems to be quite often forgotten in those debates and needs to be far more central and featured. Now, how you go about this, I think there is no one way to do this. And I think, again, that's where cities, from my point of view, and again, I don't want to, anyway, make cities the nirvana of everything, but I think that's where cities, again, have the potential to do a lot more experimentation around so-called city data collaboratives and really trying to think about how do you go about providing access. And again, I'm using the term access, which quite often doesn't mean sharing all the time, right? And I think there are different ways to actually start bridging that kind of data divide or data asymmetries that we have in society, that actually, you know, is a reason why we have the bias in the first place, but also the reason why we quite often have poor decision making or not data driven for that matter.
Thanks. I know we are nearly out of time. We could go on for a long time. There's lots of questions coming in. So I'm going to squeeze in 2 final questions, but you'll probably have to keep your answers really succinct, I'm afraid, in this last round. I want to ask, there is a question in from Anjali, who said, has there been any attempts locally or otherwise to create algorithmic solutions that are aligned with the highest needs? So it goes back to, I think, that case of prioritizing and also trying to rank when might you use an algorithm, when might you not. So does anybody have any thoughts on that? And also lots of you have spoken about kind of the use, the need for, you know, good data. We've talked about that, the need for understanding the ethics involved, for being transparent. Do you actually think that civil servants have the skills that we need to be able to deploy algorithms in the best way possible? And what implications might there be for kind of how we recruit and retain staff with the skills that are needed for this going forward? So 2 questions there, you can answer one or both. Do we have the skills in the civil service, and how do we prioritize and choose when we use algorithms or not? Millie, I'm going to start with you on this round.
Thank you, Siobhan. They're great questions. So I'll have a go at the question about skills. So I'd say, well, skills are not just quantitative skills, they're also soft skills, they're also interpersonal skills, they're also project management skills, they're also change management skills, because very often a data project is a change project, you know. So I think that's the spectrum of skills that we should be looking for in the public sector. I think we have them, but, you know, but it's making sure that they're part of data skills too. And that's a very kind of ODI approach in our data skills framework and how we think about data literacy. In terms of kind of attracting talent to the public sector, I think there's a real misperception that all that matters is money. You know, yes, there is a bit of a brain drain to the tech sector, but a lot of people, you know, they're kind of leaving tech to work for civil society or to work for the public sector, either because they find the work more rewarding or because they want to contribute to society and so on. Or, you know, government gets really interesting use cases and challenges to solve. So I think we've got to bear that in mind too. And I think what might be more sustainable, equitable, or better for the kind of data ecosystem is allowing things like secondments, work placements, allowing people to shift between, or maybe have a part-time academic place while they're working in industry, you know, allowing that talent flow across sectors is the thing, rather than assuming that it's all going to industry and public sector doesn't have it.
Great, thanks, Millie. Keith, you must have a really interesting perspective on this, both in terms of the talent that we need to draw in from outside or that's already inside, but also just helping government departments to understand where they can best invest, which algorithms are going to give them the best kind of return.
Yeah, I'll try to keep these brief.
So
part of the service we offer is cross-training and transferring skills into public sector. We do that with most of our clients. But we do find quite a few of them lose those staff soon after. And it's not just somebody who's an AI specialist. It's also sometimes people that have skills of business improvement. And as Millie says, it isn't always because of money. Sometimes it's because they get more freedom, they get broader area of responsibility. Sometimes they lost to other public sector organizations. They don't go private. So there's 4 things that I'd suggest that anybody consider if they're building up their internal capability. First is contingency plan on staff leaving, build that in. Second is partnership, work with other public sectors or private sector to have a bigger, more interesting set of problems for your teams to solve. So you can give them those development paths. Third is leverage. Don't try and hire in the golden goose that can do everything. I think, again, Millie made a good point. There's a whole variety of skills. You need a variety of people to actually participate in that. And finally, form some form of safety net. If you build a solution, particularly if it's a complex technical solution, and the person who builds it leaves, how are you going to continue to support that after you go forward? So think about how you can build it in that safety net. As far as the highest values, I'm not sure how I would answer that directly. When we work with when we work with any customer, we look at 4 things when we're prioritizing the work. What's going to give us the most benefit, whether that, however you quantify that, whether it's in monetary terms or not. Which one is going to be is change going to be most likely to be accepted? Because change is hard. Change is the biggest obstacle. Do nothing is the most likely outcome of every project you start. What the cost is and your return on investment, and then the level of complexity. You don't want to start with your most complex projects because you want to build confidence in the technology before you go and solve some really big and complex problem.
Fantastic. Thanks, Keith. Stefan, I'm going to come to you. I guess some of the examples you have at local level will give you an opportunity to compare and contrast where you might get the most benefit for the investment.
Yeah, well, on the benefit, I think we really have to, talking about skills, we really have to not only invest in data science, but also question science. And I've been advocating for many years that a lot of the value depends on the question that one poses. And we are actually very bad in formulating questions. And so as it relates to what's the highest benefit, I think every city and country should develop high value questions and really say, look, these are the questions that we really need to answer in order to improve how we go about this. And we have an initiative called 100 Questions towards that end. Now, on the skills, I think very quickly, Siobhan, I think turns out that most organizations, not only governments, but most organizations are very bad in actually knowing who knows what within their own organization, right? And I think before you start hiring and investing in new capacities, let's do a mapping of what is the current skill set within your organization and how do you actually then connect that with the increased and new demand. We did a similar kind of thing of NHS. It turns out that most of the data scientists were basically in the accountability department, right? Crunching data for accountability purpose, not in the data innovation department. And so if you really start thinking about, anyway, how do you align your assets, that starts with actually documenting who knows what.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stefan. Natalia, no pressure. I'm going to come to you for final thoughts on these 2 issues.
Great. Thank you very much. I would very much like to echo what Millie said earlier about the importance of having non-quantitative skills when we work with data and data science. And I really can't stress that enough, but having a social science background and ability to question things and look at the big picture and outcomes of data, siloed data and algorithmic projects is really important. And we've actually been doing some work on that. And in the National Data Strategy as well, we've announced that we will be looking into adding data ethics skills to various government frameworks that deal with skills. And I think this is a first step towards really reflecting on what kind of skills we do need, not just to develop good algorithms and good data science products, but also to critically evaluate them. And I think we're massively over time. So I'll just stop.
Thank you. And it's such a good place to end. I think whenever we have webinars that could get very technical, it's always interesting to me how we end up talking very much about those human issues are so important. I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you To the audience for sending in so many questions. We will answer ones behind the scenes that didn't get answered today. To our fantastic panel, to Vic, who unfortunately couldn't stay for the Q&A, but to Millie, to Keith, to Stefan, to Natalia, thank you so much for your time. The webinar has been recorded, so we will be sending around a link to everyone who was registered. They can watch it again, they can share it with their colleagues, please do so. And a big thanks again to T Impact and to Keith for being our knowledge partners today. Really helpful to have you with us on the panel. We will also send a link round with an article in a week or so that will have the key issues from this discussion as well, which people can share with their networks. So from me, wherever you are in the world, enjoy the rest of your day, your evening, your morning, and I hope to see you at another webinar again very soon. Thanks to everybody and goodbye for now. Thanks so much.
Thank you.